before we get into the heart of this evening's presentation, there are a couple of questions which I've been asked. The first one is quite simple. Last week I talked about storing wine. Is it really worthwhile? And in general, I think it's probably not worth it. Not living in South Florida in the 21st century, storing wine for it to improve in your own home is probably really not worthwhile, unless you want to really make it a hobby. The other question I received following that was, are there downsides to storing wine? In other words, will it go off? Are there certain wines that you don't want to store? And certainly, I mean, that's true. White wine, most white wines don't age well. When you get them, you might as well drink them. Other wines, red wines, Beaujolais is a famous one, particularly Beaujolais Nouveau. It's released by the French government, permits it to be released on the 3rd Thursday of November. In fact, the week before American Thanksgiving. Nothing, I mean, pure coincidence. But in other words, it's only a few weeks old from being plucked at the vendage, to being bottled, to being sold. And that goes off very, very quickly. I don't know if you've bought any Beaujolais Nouveau, and it's 6 months or 9 months old, or last year's. It's really very, very boring, very, very flat. The other wines, the other time you might come across wine which has been stored too long is if you're in a wine store and you see, wow, this is fabulous wine. I can't believe it. I've read about it. Patrick's talked about it. I've seen it in books, and it's only, and that's probably because it's past its time. And what happens with wine over the ages is that when the oxygen gets to it, as I think I told you in the first class, a young red wine is purplish. Keats's poem, purple stained lips. And certainly the Beaujolais are purple. And they mature, they become, the best color for a red wine is ruby. But once the oxygen starts getting, whether seeping through the cork or just the inevitability of age, it starts going brown. So quite often I've bought what I thought was a really good deal. I can't believe they sold it at this price, but you get it home and you see the color, and it's sort of brown and it's oxidized, and it's gradually turning back into eventually it will turn to vinegar, because that's what oxygen does. It turns the wine into vinegar, which we'll talk about just a moment. So that's the whole question of aging wine. The big question that I've been asked, and several of you asked in various different ways, is about pricing. And because this evening we're going to be talking about expensive wines, and we're going to be talking about prices, I thought I'd better address it. Now, I usually avoid talking about prices. Several reasons. The main one is it's really, really complex to do with wine. It's not like, for example, a book. You know, you buy a paperback and it costs, I don't know, $10, because it's flimsy, it's small, it's a paperback. You go and buy hardback version, and very good one, by the way. But this is $30. But there's an obvious, you can understand the reason why the difference between the $10 and the $30. And then you get a big fancy one, and it's got colored pictures and maps and all sorts of things, and that costs $70. But there's a logic to that. You understand it. Same as cars. You buy a Toyota, you buy a VW, and it's 20 bucks or so, and it gets you around, and it's good, and it's perfect, and you're very happy. But your friends you then move up, you get a BMW, an Audi, and you're moving into the $40, $50 range, but it's got leather seats. It goes faster. It uses less gas. There are all those reasons, and they will explain to you why this is better than that and why the price is therefore higher. And then you move up to a Bentley, and again, there are reasons for that. So you understand reason between a paperback and a big fancy coffee table book, and a Toyota and a Bentley. But with wine, there they all are. They're all 750 centiliters, either red or the white. What's the difference? It's very, very, very confusing. And there are other things which make it even more confusing. Well, I've tried to simplify it. In my book, I actually, in the same way that I talked about cars or paperbacks to fancy coffee table books, in my book, I have analyzed right here the logical reason for different prices. In other words, I've taken an example of somebody paying $2,000 a ton for grapes, a winery doing that. And with that, with the cost of the grapes, the cost of the oaking, the barreling, the fermenting, they end up with a cost of goods by the time they've got it in the bottle of $5. And this is an industry standard. Industry standard is if your wine, as a winery, costs you $5 to make, then you charge $10 to the distributor. The distributor, that's in this country where we have laws about how wine can be sold, dating back to Prohibition, then the distributor puts on a 30% increase. He gives it to the retailer gives a 30% surcharge. So we end up with a bottle of wine which actually costs the winery $5 to make, and I, as a customer going into the store, it costs me $20. So I give that breakdown. I mean, I don't want to bore you too much with the details, but that is possible. That's a very simple example. But then you get into marketing, and somebody will decide. So that's a basic model of pricing wine. But let's say I'm going to spend a fortune, me as either as a winemaker or as a distributor, advertising it and promoting it. And there are all sorts of things that come into play. For example, I don't know how many of you have bought a bottle of wine, and when you've emptied it, pleasurably, the bottle seems heavier than another one. What's all that about? Why are some bottles heavier than others? Pure marketing. They like you to get the feel that a heavy bottle has got more quality. There's absolutely no difference there's no reason for that. I really resent that a lot. Then we get fancy labels. Well, obviously, we talked about Chateau Mouton, de Rothschild. He was famous for getting Picasso and Braque and David Hockey to paint his labels. Well, that's fair enough. And anyway, those are going for hundreds of dollars a bottle. But you've all seen fancy bottles which have got gold flaking, and I tend to move again. My philosophy is if they put that much energy and money into making the bottle look fancy, then they're covering up the inadequacy of the contents of the wine. But again, that's a personal thing. It's not always true. For example, the Amarone we're drinking this evening, all Amarone bottles that I've seen all tend to have pretty fancy labels, and that's sort of goes with it. Same as a lot of the wines from the Chateau Neuf de Pape, a lot of the wines from the Southern Rhone that we looked at last week also have embossing on the bottles. So, you know, there's not a hard and fast rule there. When I was director of the wine program at the University of Miami, well, before that, Jude and I moved here in 1980, and that was about the time that the Chileans decided to break into the United States market. And the wineries in Chile were all owned by bankers. Rothschild, for example, moved down there in 1978, I think, did a big deal with Concha y Toro. So that's when they decided we need to get our Chilean wines, build up the reputation, and get it into the world's growing biggest market, which is the United States. And Jude and I moved here at exactly that time when the Chileans were coming in. And because they were all wealthy bankers and insurance companies and Rothschilds, they had a pact that they would sell their wine for 10 years at a loss. They'd get into the market and prove to the Americans and to eventually the Europeans that their wines had good quality. But they do that by selling at a loss, and they had the wealth, the capital background to do that, and they've done it. So certainly back in the 80s and 90s when we first moved here, Chilean wine was such a bargain, and now they've established a reputation. The prices are going up. The Brazilians took the opposite point of view, and when I was, as I said, when I was at directing a wine program, I was approached by the Brazilians, and in fact, the chap in charge of their wine program, based in the embassy in Washington, came down and he explained. He was very, very candid. He said, "We're going to advertise, we're going to promote our wines in certain fancy places. We're going to put the prices up high. We're going to make the wines look good," and that was their approach. Now, I love Brazil, but Brazilian wines are awful. I've never had one that I really enjoyed. And I was in a nice position where I would have loved to have enjoyed them. And quite frankly, that was what, 10 years ago or more, and you don't see much Brazilian wine around. I don't think that technique worked. But I gave those two examples to show you that pricing wine is quite a complex thing and involves all sorts of marketing issues which really mean nothing to us as the consumers. Another important thing is the psychology of it. So, and I found this when I was giving live classes rather than Zoom classes. If I said to you, this next wine we're having is really expensive, it's a $90 bottle, and half of you would think, wow, and they get excited and you look forward to it and wow, this is, oh. And the other half of you would think, ooh, I don't like that. You'd be repulsed psychologically beforehand. Now, I'm not saying this because I just made it up. They've done a lot of studies. They've put people in MRI, in the MRI and told them, and they've actually measured the excitement levels in the brain when people anticipate that they're getting this fancy, expensive glass of wine. Another thing which messes up the whole business of prices, I sound like the president here, it's China. The Chinese millionaires have suddenly got involved in wine. This is over the past 10 or 12 years. And I would remind you to see that movie Obsession, which is all about the wines of Bordeaux, where the Chinese are buying them up. And they have really ruined the prices of what they're so expensive now, you just can't afford to get them. When Jude and I lived there, admittedly, half a century ago, we could afford, as a special, very special treat, to get some of these great wines. Whereas now they're costing a minimum of a couple of $1,000s a bottle, which is obviously impossible. And the Russian mafia have also had a similar effect on messing up the prices of wine. Now, I did get an email this morning from Francisco, and he basically said the Amarone that we're having tonight, which we got from Trader Joe's, costs $19, $20. Was he checked out Total Wine and a few other places, and the prices are 40 or 50 more. Why the discrepancy? So that's another reason why I don't like talking about prices. And later on, I'll show you a slide that has the various different prices of Amarone. But the first thing I think you need to do is to pour some and taste it. I'm going to talk to you in a few moments about Amarone, where it comes from, how it's made. But for the moment, it's just a red wine, and we'll ignore whether it costs $40 or whether it costs $20. I opened this just half an hour ago, and it's already got a very, very nice nose. I'm getting wood. I'm getting leaves. I'm getting fall. That is so smooth and rich. Well, we'll talk about where it comes from and why it's special in just a moment. So to sum up everything, again, going back to the famous book, in it, I list 40 different wines. I call it 40 wines you should taste before you die. A wide selection. And I think if you like wine, try them all. I mean, you know, we all get stuck in our, oh, well, I like that and I don't like that. No, 40 of them. And my rule is probably 90% of the ones I list are under $10. Always go for the cheap. I'm a big believer in most good wines can be bought for less than $10. Now, I know all the wines in this particular class have been priced around $20. Stag's Leap way up there. But I'm a big believer in trying as many wines, different wines as possible, under $10. And at under $10, you can afford to go through the, slowly go through, don't have to do it all in one evening. All 40 wines. And that way you'll discover wines that you like. And once you've discovered a wine, oh, I really like this. Then at that point, go and buy a more expensive version and see whether it's any better. And sometimes it will be, sometimes you will do that as a treat, but you already like the under $10 bottle. And quite often you'll buy one, for example, I don't know how many of you, you drank a $50 bottle 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Stag's Leap. And how did that compare to the other wines, the $20 bottles that we've had during this course, this program? So it's always worth exploring to see whether that, and I know I'm going to be asked later this evening when we get into some really ridiculous prices, whether the stratospheric prices are worth it. Probably not. So I'm a big believer in wines to try under $10. There are 1 or 2 exceptions that you can't get under $10. For example, the Amarone del Policella, we've got a good price this evening at $20. It's usually $35, $40 and up. So I'm going to, oh, do we have any more in the, anybody waiting? No, I think everybody's here. Now we're going to get a give me just a second to set this up. Okay. So, going back to what we were discussing last week about storing wine. Yes, storing wine can be a good investment. And look at this. This was done, I believe, this was a couple of years ago. I got these figures, and they might have changed somewhat. But basically, wine is the top investment. Chinese ceramics, forget about it. Antique furniture, gone. Jewelry, you see, I could have an argument with my wife about whether we invest in jewelry or wine, but definitely wine. However, if you look at this graph and you think, oh, good, I'm going to go out and take the family money and invest it in wine, be aware that you don't take it home. The moment I purchase wine and take it home as an investment, darling, I'm not going to drink it all, it loses its value because I'm not a wine broker. So if you want to invest in wine and get that 25% return, what you do is you give your money to a broker who stores the wine under very controlled conditions, and it's all documented. So it's an investment just like that, and you get as much pleasure from it as you would if knowing that your money is in a bank, but you can't actually see it. Of course, you can go along to the broker and you can take out a bottle or two, which will reduce your investment, and take it home and drink it. But don't mix up the idea of having a nice wine cellar of your own wines as being an investment. The moment you've taken control of it, it's out of the system. It's no longer documented. It's no longer, you cannot set it back on the market. So it's not a good investment in that sense. But let's get on to, I hope I've straightened that out for you all. Technical problems again. There we go. This is an English poet from the early 20th century. Quinquerine of Nineveh from distant Ophir, rowing home to haven in sunny Palestine with a cargo of ivory and apes and peacocks, sandalwood, cedarwood, and sweet white wine. I'm emphasizing that because sweet white wine is not really thought of as wine these days, because we all have too much saccharin and we're all trying to cut down on our sugar. But through most of history, certainly all through the Middle Ages, there was a total lack of sugar, and the rich drank sweet white wine. That's what they wanted. All the great wines that one hears about in history that the aristocracy used were sweet and white. For example, the Falernian, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that's what the Romans prized about, the Roman emperors prized above all others. And then the Constantia from South Africa, that Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great and Napoleon, they all loved, and Jane Austen, they all loved that. There's Chateau d'Yquem, which we'll be talking about a bit later, enthusiastically. That again, sweet white wine. Most wines, because they didn't know how to really to store them throughout most of the Middle Ages, they were bitter. When we talk about Christ up on the cross and the Roman soldiers holding up a sponge with vinegar in it, that's always regarded as being them torturing Christ. It wasn't. That's what people drank. That's what wine tasted like. It tasted like vinegar. It quenched your thirst, but it wasn't delicious. So it's sweet white wine. And the way that white wine was made, particularly in the Levant, in what today we call the Holy Land, in the Eastern Mediterranean, was then sold. These are the best wines. And from Roman times onwards, the best wines came from there, and the Venetians, through the Middle Ages, tended to control the trade. And their quinquerines went all as far as England. And the way that the wine was made was the grapes were picked and stored in baskets. We can see here. So immediately after the harvest, the grapes were stored there, put in the sun, and allowed to shrivel up. And the result of that was that as they got smaller and smaller, it concentrated the flesh inside, concentrating the sugars, and only after that were they fermented. The result was a very, very sweet wine. The area, and originally this was all over the Middle East. Today, and through the 20th century really, the only place where that's continued has been inland from Venice, round here, Lake Garda, near Verona. And the area is called Valpolicella. And the grape itself is the Corvina grape, which isn't terribly, it's a bit like a pale Merlot. And you can go and buy Valpolicella wine, But again, it's not terribly exciting. But when they concentrate the grapes like this, they made a very sweet, well, what happens, because it's so sweet, and as I think I've mentioned, when you're fermenting wine, the yeasts in the skin turn the sugars into alcohol. But there comes a point where the yeasts die. There's too much alcohol, they die, and that's usually about 14%. So what they used to call the Recioto della Valpolicella, because it's the Recioto from here, that was the system. It was called appassimento, this whole system of turning them into almost like raisins and then fermenting them. And that was well known, and that was producing this wonderful, very strong, sweet white wine, because if the yeast dies before it's all converted into alcohol, then the residual sugar makes it a sweet wine. And then sometime in the 1950s, they discovered a new yeast. And this yeast was resilient to alcohol, which meant that it could convert all the sugar into alcohol without dying, which meant that the wine was no longer sweet. So they called it Amarone, which in the local dialect means the bitter one. And that's what we're drinking now. So around this area, around Valpolicella, it's very forested, it's woodland, a lot of game. So you can imagine this wine is perfect with a gamey meal. And I like it. It's so we're now going to really go back to the question that I was asked by Francisco in an email earlier this morning. How is it that Trader Joe's is selling this Amarone at $20? And if you go to Total Wines, other places it's going to be $40 or $50. So I looked it up online. It's called Wine Searcher. This is just one example, but we can see here these are all. And don't forget in order to call your wine Amarone da Valpolicella Classico DOCG, and the DOCG, I think I explained this before. On the neck of the bottle, this is a government stamp, and you see it's DOCG. Denominazione d'origine controllata garantia, guaranteed by the Italian government. And these are all official DOCG versions of Amarone. But look at the price differences. And these are all for single bottles, 348, 55, 73. We definitely got a deal with our 1998. So I hope that helps also answer the question of why I don't like talking about prices, because it is really so complicated. Why is this particular one 348 and this one is 55, and the one we're drinking now is, there's a certain amount of, you can see here a score, that got 93, that got 91, but does that really account for that enormous price difference? I don't know. But now you understand why I really don't like talking about prices. It really is very, very complicated. So tonight we're going to talk about really expensive wines. We'll come back in a moment to Jefferson's Lafite, which are portrayed here in the illustration. We'll also come back to Penfolds Ampoule. We'll see a picture of that. The greatest wines, I think, and I've been doing, and this is based, unfortunately, not on my own experience drinking wines, but just doing pure research. But just as we saw last week, I think the Domaine de la Romani Conti, and hopefully some of you read that article from Vanity Fair about the assassins in the vineyard. The Romani Conti does seem to be the world's, accepted to be the world's greatest wine. And that's Burgundy. But there's also a lot of people who prefer Chateau Petrus. That's one of the highest, and that's almost a Merlot, and that's from the left bank, sorry, the right bank in Bordeaux. Legendary wines we'll be talking about next week, actually. Vega Sicilia from Spain and a Tokai from Hungary. We're going to discuss Champagne, and we've got interesting stories. Again, this will be next week. Mathias Rosé and Rutsheimer Apostelwein. Various vinous superlatives. The most expensive wine on the market. And by on the market, I mean you can just go out and buy it. You know, it's not a famous one. We're not talking about $500 bottles of wine. Just, I'm going to go out and get a really expensive wine. Then it's, again, Romanée-Conti that we discussed in detail last week. And they're about $19,000, $20,000 a bottle. You know, like that, $20,000. The most expensive bottle of wine ever sold was, again, a Romanée-Conti, and we'll be looking at that a little later this evening. Almost $600,000. The oldest wine on the market is a Lennox Madeira, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. By on the market, I mean you could. If you're very excited at the end of this evening, you could go online and buy a bottle. The oldest bottle ever sold was the Speyer of Vin d'Arbois, and that was, I can't remember what. Oh, that was given it was old, but they tasted it before and they gave it a 9.4 out of 10 rating, even though it was that old. Probably turned a little bit brown. The oldest wine in existence today, the Speyer, that was actually a Roman wine, still sealed, it's never been opened, and they found it in a grave in Germany in the late 19th century. From Germany, well, the most expensive from Germany, Igor Müller, Fastenberger Riesling, Hochenbirnhauslese. I only put it there because I like saying words like that. We'll look at that in just in a moment, because that's worth talking about. And the rarest wine on the market is the Ampoule from Penfolds, which we'll see a photograph in just a moment. So I just wanted to give you the various extremes that we can get to with wine. Now this is a Madeira, and Madeira is very interesting, and I know some of the people here are in Charleston in this class, and there's a very strong connection with Madeira and Charleston. Madeira is an island off the coast of Africa. It was owned by the Portuguese, and all the sailing ships that left from Europe, whether they were English or French or Portuguese or Spanish, would go down to Madeira and then cross the Atlantic. It was to do with the prevailing winds and all that sort of thing. And in Madeira, they made this fortified wine, which they, for some reason, called Madeira. And because it was fortified, it meant it could cross the Atlantic very well and still be good. So it was the most popular wine in the colonies, and in fact it was used for signing the Declaration of Independence. Washington, Jefferson, they were all knocking it back, and in Charleston it was particularly popular. Now the Church of England decided to send a bishop, might have been an archbishop, out to Charleston to become the local bishop, and so he set off from England, from Plymouth, down to Madeira with his wife and his children, and they stopped off in Madeira, which is the normal thing to do. Well, the boat then went to Charleston with the wife and the children, and the bishop stayed on the island for another year. He fell in love with Madeira. Eventually they managed to drag him off and took him to Charleston, where he was supposed to be the bishop, and he was delighted to discover that there was a lot of Madeira in Charleston, so he was able to stay. A little bit of history there. Here are some of, these are just a few of the most expensive wines. Now the Cheval Blanc, for example, it's a 6-litre bottle at $303,000. That works out about $38,000 per bottle. And the Screaming Eagle, which we'll be looking at a little bit later, that was $500,000, again for a 6-litre bottle. So that works out at $62,500 per bottle. But again, that was at an auction, so it's not typical prices for Screaming Eagle. The Chateau Lafite, that is the one that has Jefferson's name on, and we'll look at that in just a moment. The Shipwreck Champagne, that was it was a whole load of champagne being shipped to the Tsars of Russia early in the First World War. The ship was sank to the bottom of the Baltic, was freezing water, and only discovered a few years ago, and the champagne is all perfect. So the idea that it was destined for the Tsars of the last Tsar of Russia, and it had all that history, that sort of accounts for why that price is there. The 1985 $22,000 bottle. Henri Geyer is probably the most famous Burgundian winemaker. He died a few years ago, but his wines are apparently legendary. So again, going back to this, why is this, you know, what are prices based on? That is because he's dead now. Everyone reckons his wines were the best. It's a Romani Conti, which we've talked about endlessly. And so the cost, Parentout was the name of his little vineyard, and it was one of the smallest vineyards in France. So again, very, very limited. So I think, as you saw from the article in Vanity Fair last week, another thing that accounts for prices is rarity. If there isn't much of it, then the price goes up. Lafite. That was, I mentioned earlier that prices have been thrown out of whack by the Chinese. And the Chinese discovered Bordeaux. These are Chinese millionaires over the past probably 20 years. They've discovered Bordeaux. They don't even know about Burgundy, thank goodness, yet. So again, I'm mentioning, you can see down the bottom there, Red Obsession, this wonderful movie, which, and the red, it's obviously referring to the Chinese influence, but also to the red wines of Bordeaux. And I do encourage you all to see it. But this bottle actually sold for 1.8 million Hong Kong dollars. And it's the most expensive single bottle. Some of the other bottles we've looked at, they're magnums at 6 litres. This is the most expensive single bottle ever sold. So the other thing, when I was doing research for this whole program, I got used to these numbers. Bottle of Lafite, $234,000. So you become acclimatized to that. So I'm looking here. This is Wine Searcher, the world's 50 most expensive wines. So on the right-hand column, you can see the maximum price paid for a bottle. Well, and obviously that was the one we've just been looking at, the Romani Conti. But these are the average prices, and these, what continues to surprise me is that there are people around who are paying these prices just for drinking them, not for getting their names on the headlines in the newspaper for, wow, look what I've done. These are just regular prices. $20,000, $18,000, $13,000, $12,000. And there's not just one bottle that you can go out and find, there's a whole stack of them. They're there, it's on the market. And the other interesting thing, going back to last week, if you look at the red stars, That is, you remember our friend Omre de Villaine, the DRC, the Domaine Romane Conti? Those are his, the one at the top, the one at the bottom. And you remember his nemesis, the blonde lady, Lilou Leroy? She's got two of hers there. And the other thing you notice here is that most of these are wines from Burgundy, not from Bordeaux. There's a German wine there. There's nothing from Bordeaux, actually. There's a Madeira. But these are, so the prices on the right-hand column, yes, they're extraordinary. Those are big, fancy auctions or whatever. But the prices on the middle column, those are just everyday prices that there are people around who pay. So just, and I think this gives you an example. Let's go in with Madame Leroy with her Moussinier, which I've pictured there. Let's go in and we want to buy one. And you've got a whole choice. You can see there, this is a screenshot, so I can't move through, but you can see, you can pick your year. I picked 1961, and there it is in London. You can go and there's the hedonism wines, basically $16,000. That's before tax. So it'll be a little bit over $16,000. Okay, I'm going to unmute you all for a bit. Dylan has still been banned. So, do we have any questions at this stage in the game? And how do you like our Amarone? I think you're all unmuted, so
Patrick.
Yes.
Do the wine prices you just mentioned take into account, we just watched the documentary Sour Grapes, of all the fake wine that went into auctions, or those legit real wines at those real prices?
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie, so
you have to see it.
But in just a moment, when I mute you all again, we're going to go back to the Jefferson wines, and I'm going to raise the whole subject. I'm not going into much detail about it because it's so vast, but of wine fraud. Because when you get into this sort of number, when you're talking about these sort of prices, then there's obviously, that obviously attracts all the bad boys, and there's enormous possibility for fraud. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Any other questions?
Hello, Patrick. Salita here.
Hi, Salita. You were hidden last week.
Yeah, I know. We figured out how to set it up so we could both be on there. So I was wondering, are you going to talk about Chateau d'Yquem this evening?
Yes.
Okay. And I have a second question. After our class last time, Ann and I watched Sideways. I had watched it, I don't know what, 20 years ago, or whenever it was. I don't understand how that movie killed Merlot.
Sorry, I don't understand how that movie...
I just don't get it.
You don't get what?
Merlot for such a long time.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I was thinking, yes, Sideways. Sideways, for those of you...
it was pro Pinot Noir, but he only says it one time. No, don't serve me Merlot. And for years, Merlot was in trouble. And
yes.
I don't get it after watching the movie. Can you explain?
Well, again, you know, it's almost going back to my original thing about why I don't like talking about prices, because all these things are so ephemeral. They depend. I'm talking about wine. I'm talking about fine art, and they all depend on fashions and. That's why these awful people that on social media are called influencers. They do have a tremendous influence, and if you know, there's a good example. The movie Sideways came out. It was very popular. It was very immediate, and although I accept what you say, that there was only one reference to Merlot, but as a result of that famous remark, don't give me Merlot, it's awful, I only want Pinot Noir. As a result, everyone switched to Pinot Noir. And I know people were pulling up vineyards, pulling up their Merlot plants and replanting them in California. We're down to human nature. Why ask why?
Yeah.
I hope that answers.
Yes.
Are we ready to move on? Because now we can move on to Jefferson's bottles. I'm running a little late, I'm afraid. Any other questions before? No? Okay. Mute all. There we go.
Mute me.
Allow them to know. So, Jefferson and fraud. Oh, technical problems. I apologize for this. There we go. So I think I might have mentioned this before. Jefferson was ambassador to the French court after the War of Independence, and Jefferson was a dedicated wine lover. He always wanted to develop wine in America, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, while he was in France, he was buying up wines to ship home. And we do have detailed records, well documented, of a visit to Bordeaux where he bought a lot of Haut-Brion, Chateau Lafite. We have the receipts, we have the invoices, we have the delivery notes, and they were delivered to his rented apartment in Paris. And then, of course, the revolution happened, or he knew that the revolution was, he got the feeling that things were falling apart. So he moved back to America. And we have all the documentation of all of that as household goods and blah, blah, blah. I don't think Jefferson was a smuggler. So, but the wines which we know were delivered from Bordeaux to Paris vanished. We don't know, there was no trace of them. They were never brought in to America. And then, I don't know, 50 years ago or so, somebody knocked down the wall in Paris, and the building where Jefferson had his rooms, and lo and behold, there you see all these wonderful bottles with scratched on them the date and THJ. So, these were the mysterious Jefferson wines. And of course, enormous excitement and enormous money. There we got it. And that's all the subject of this wonderful book called The Billionaire's Vinegar. And the book was all about wine fraud, and it really starts off with Jefferson's wines. I mean, they're obviously, this is so unique, the bottle that Thomas Jefferson had. So Malcolm Forbes, for example, bought a bottle for $156,000 for just a bottle. And what the book explores is, one, there's a whole world of people who believe. Remember, in the second class, I told you about phylloxera. And phylloxera was this disease that swept across Europe, wiped out all the vineyards. So from the 1860s to really to the beginning of the 20th century, there was no wine in Europe. And then they worked out how to fix it, and they got rootstock from America and planted that in France, and then put on the original French. They grafted on the original French vines. But the taste is different. And there's a lot of people, a lot of wealthy people, who say, oh, I could not, American rootstock, no. So there's a whole group of people who only drink wine that was bottled prior to 1860, pre-phylloxera. Well, you know, you need a bit of money to do that, but surprisingly, there's a whole world of people who do that. And that's all they drink. No, I'm not going to drink anything that's been bottled post-phylloxera. So, I mean, this book is fascinating. It introduces you to that whole world. But at the same time, it introduces you to the whole world of rather unsavory people who make fraudulent wine. And it also introduces the idea of, let's say I had bought this, you know, and I'm very proud of it. And all the people whose respect I like admire me because I bought this and I own it. And then somebody comes along and says, well, you know, it's possibly fraudulent. Maybe somebody made it in their back kitchen. Do you want to find out? You're torn. No, I want to keep it. I want to get the, you know, the respect of my peers and leave it to my grandson. Oh, but no, you don't. What we can do, we can put a needle in, and we can do this, we can do that, we can put it through an MRI machine, whatever. I don't want to know. I've just spent $500,000 on this bottle. I don't want, you know. So the book is fascinating in describing quandaries like that. What I'm going to do this evening is send you a short article about, you know, the Koch brothers. Not terribly popular with the left wing, but one of the brothers was a wine collector. And most wealthy people who get conned, whether they buy a false Picasso or a phony Thomas Jefferson Lafite, feel stupid. And they keep quiet about it. And that's what most crooks depend on. Well, Koch went out. He said, I've been conned millions of dollars, and he had a big court case, and I'll send you the article. And it is fascinating. It's a whole world of art, of forgery. This is a good example. Next week, we're going to talk about Penfolds, because Penfolds is an Australian winery which makes excellent, really excellent wine. In fact, the main Penfolds comes out at $500 a bottle, and then of course people jack the price up and they're selling it to each other, but the minimum price is $500. But this particular one is, as you can see, there's only 12 of them. It's all crystal, and I think the amazing thing is that the senior, because you can't get into it, you buy this at 170 grand, and you can't actually open it yourself. You have to phone up Australia, and then the executive comes over and he actually opens it for you. I just have little fantasies about that. What do? You're sitting down. I just like, my wife and I, we're going to drink it this evening with that. So you get the Australian, he comes in, he knocks at the door, he comes in and opens it. Do you send him off again, or do you have to offer him a glass of wine? These are things that worry me. This is why I'm not really ready to buy one of these yet. But there it is. It's the Penfolds Ampule. This is the famous Romani Conti. And you can see, remember last week we were talking about, let me see if this is still working. We were talking about Vilaine, Aubrey de Vilaine. He's two things about him. He owns the Domaine Romani Conti. He was the ex-partner, if you like, with Leroy. And he was also one of the judges in the 1976 competition that Stag's Leap won. And he was there in 1945. Apparently, 1945, if you can imagine, we'd gone through 5 years of war, most devastating war in Europe, with American deaths and European deaths. And 1940, and it all came to an end in 1945. And 1945 was one of the best harvests ever in history. And that's why this actually reached that price. There were only 600 bottles. And not only, so that was in Burgundy, but it was still a great year over in Bordeaux. So the Chateau Mouton Rothschild, that was before, when it was still a second growth, before Philippe had upped it to being the first growth. And the V in the label here is Churchill's V for Victory, which was so important. So as I put here, so this one went for, it was a Jeroboam, which is 6 regular bottles, 310,000. So if you reckon that one glass is about, one bottle will give you about 6 glasses. The average price, one of these for a glass, I mean a decent glass, not up to there, just to here, 8,630. It has to be good. And it wasn't just 1945. Oops. I'm sorry. Technology. Cheval Blanc. Again, this is a 6-litre bottle for 304. Going back to what I was saying about prices blowing the market. When Jude and I lived in France, in this area, embarrassingly 50 years ago, this was in our price range. I don't mean we drank this regularly, but it was, I do remember buying a bottle for my father. So probably I'm guessing that would be the equivalent of maybe $50. It was a special occasion, but it was a Cheval Blanc. There's a whole story to it, actually. We drove very slowly across France to meet my father in Dijon, and we had a dog with us called Dog. And I drove very, very slowly because I didn't want to disturb the bottle. Jude was 8 months pregnant at the time, but that was beside the point. I was driving carefully for the bottle. And when we got to the hotel, I got out and I put the bottle carefully on the ground. Then I went round to help Jude get out of the car. And while I was doing that, the dog jumped out and landed on the bottle and smashed it. So, but anyway, there's another dog story about Cheval Blanc, is that Robert Parker, the American critic, reviewed a Cheval Blanc in the 1980s, I think it was, 1990s, and gave it a very poor review. And he is in the Wine Spectator. And the following year, he was doing his usual tour of all the chateaus. And he'd come around, you know, I'm Robert Parker, and here I am. And when he got to Cheval Blanc, he was greeted at the gate by the owner of Cheval Blanc with a large dog. And here I am, I'm Robert Parker, I'm having to, and the dog bit him on the leg, drew blood, and Robert Parker stood back and, can you get me a Band-Aid? Can you get me something? Look, it's drawing blood. And the owner of the of Cheval Blanc pulled out the offending magazine article and said, yeah, you can wrap your leg with this, monsieur. That's my favorite Cheval Blanc Robert Parker story. Chateau d'Yquem. Sarita, you asked if I was going to talk about Chateau d'Yquem. This is Christian Vanik. He's the sommelier at Tour d'Argent. He was another one of the judges in the 1976 wine tasting, and he's very proud here because this is the most expensive bottle of white wine ever sold. Chateau d'Yquem is extraordinary. and because it's and also very expensive, and which is why people don't really understand the joy of it. I've only had it once, but I am familiar with Sauterne wines from that region. But basically, you put it into your mouth. It's very high in alcohol, and it is got a lot of residual sugar. And you put it into your mouth, and you never get around to swallowing it. It just evaporates. It goes straight into the brain. It's absolutely unique, and I can't speak highly enough of it, particularly at $117,000 a bottle. But you can get bottles for less than that. Egan Müller, let me, German wines are usually, most of the German wines we get in this country are not very good. They're sweet, the Liebfraumilch and Blue Nun and things like that. But that's unfair. Some of the best white wines in the world do come from Germany. The Saar, where this comes from, is a small north-flowing tributary of the Moselle near the Luxembourg border. Planted by the Romans, all the Riesling vineyards are on steep south-facing slopes. Since the early Middle Ages, most of the vineyards and estates have been owned by the Catholic Church, monasteries, or mysterious and anonymous Anstalts headquartered in Liechtenstein. Now, since most harvests fail due to the poor weather, and don't forget this is very north in Europe, only 3 or 4 years in a decade will produce a decent wine, which means that the people who own a vineyard have to be extremely wealthy in order to carry all the bad years. However, when the conditions are good and the Rieslings of these two rivers produce some of the rarest and most expensive white wines in the world, they're famous for being lush, fragrant, and fruity, combining the most delicate balance of high acidity with rich sweetness. And that really is the magic of good Rieslings when you have it. It's both sweet and acidic. And that magical balance is quite unique, but hard to find. The most famous vineyard is Schwarzenhofberg, which is we've got there, which dates back at least as far as 1037. That's 981 years ago. As part of the Weingut Egan Müller estate, widely considered to be amongst the greatest white wines in the world. So I wrote this book in 2009, I think, and I wrote the following. 2006, Egan Müller ice wines were selling at 1,500 euros per bottle. And in 2001, 24 bottles of Egan Müller 1994 Schwarzen Hofberg Trockenbeerenauslese sold for $4,718 each. Euros. So when I was preparing for this evening's class, I thought I would just check those prices again, see how it had moved. So 2001, 24 sold for 4,000, nearly 5,000 euros each. This I just got online a couple of days ago. That's a half bottle, $4,000. A Magnum, but $22,000. This one, $34,000. And the prices are just really going through the roof, particularly for really expensive wines. The thing that, going back to my original thing about prices, going back 50 years when I started consciously drinking wine and knowing about prices, I could afford, it's just an ordinary person, I could afford for a special treat some of these famous wines because they weren't, the prices weren't outrageous. But most people drank pretty crappy wine, and most of the wine was pretty crappy and pretty awful. What's happened in the 50 years since is that all the bad wine has gone. If you make bad wine, you're out of business. So, but the expensive wines have just shot through the roof. So they're out of most people's reach. The consolation is that we have access to a lot of, most wine is good and affordable. And as I started the evening by saying, for $10, you can get a good example of most wines. Very quickly, just go through. Californians have turned this whole business of wine, they've got a lot of cult wines. So we'll talk about Screaming Eagle in just a second. I'll read you from their website. Sine Qua Non, for example, those are the standard prices for their wines. You can't get one for less than $3,000 a bottle. These are cult wines. They've got you know, it's all to do with marketing. For example, the Ghost Horse, they sell about $1,000 a bottle, but they're so cultish that the collectors, a lot of them will buy it by the barrel, and a barrel will give you 276 bottles, and that works out about $360 a bottle instead of $1,000 a bottle, but you have to bottle it yourself. However, if you order the bottle, the owner of the vineyard will deliver it to your door in person. And then down the bottom here, Sloan Proprietary Red. Just to get onto their waiting list, you have to be vetted. They check you out, they send attorneys around to see who you are, and then you're permitted to be on their waiting list, where eventually, if you're lucky enough, you can spend $600 or $700. I keep doing this, I know, but per bottle, that's what you're getting, a bottle. Okay, this is Screaming Eagle. This is the most famous one. Founded in 1986. It's a mixture of, it's very much a Bordeaux wine, even though it's from the Napa Valley. It's Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. And those are the three main grapes of the six in Bordeaux. It's from Oakville. Robert Parker gave it a 99, this is early on, 99 points, and that's what really put it on the map. And since then, it's just become a legendary, one of those legendary bottles. So the $500,000, which I showed you earlier, that was for a 6-liter bottle, and it was at an auction. So it was for, you know, it was all to do with publicity and for a good cause and all that sort of thing. But on average, as you can see here, they're all about $2,500 per bottle. And I know that the question you're probably all going to ask me is, I recommend $10 bottles, and then we've had a $20 bottle this evening, and we've had a $50 bottle. Does the pleasure that one gets, you know, does it increase? How? I've never had a $2,500 bottle, so I can't tell you. Maybe it does. Maybe that the pleasure principle is so intense. I don't know the answer to that, so please don't ask. Let me read from their website. This is the Screaming Eagle website, their FAQs. I put my name on the waiting list several years ago. How long is the wait? Unfortunately, we cannot give you a firm time frame. A place for you will only become available if and when an active member drops off the list. Any change of address since your original sign up on the waiting list can be emailed, faxed, or sent via US Postal Service. You can also update your contact information by logging onto your account. What about charity donations? We are sadly not in a position to consider individual charity requests this year. We will donate to Auction Napa Valley 2013 in the hopes that the most possible charitable dollars can be funneled back into Napa Valley. Can I visit the property? We are sorry to report that the property cannot accommodate tours, and that because of the extremely small quantity of wine produced, we do not offer tastings. Can I get on your waiting list? Please check on our waiting list icon, and that will guide you to our waiting list sign-up page. Please note that you'll only be contacted by Screaming Eagle once you have moved from the waiting list to the active member list. In other words, shove off. Okay, that's first part of our, I'll unmute you to see if we have any okay, any questions following that? And I'm sorry, again, I went over time. Next week, we're really going to continue with these expensive wines, but next week the focus is going to be more on wines which have an interesting story behind them. But again, we'll be, and that website that I've used a couple of times, Wine Searcher, will show you just how common, just how widely dispersed these wines are. And that's really what has shocked me in doing the research for this program is, you know, I'm so used to seeing $235,000 for a bottle of wine. Oh, you get used to that. I've got to the point where I see, oh, it's only 1,000. That's, you know, it's not worth mentioning. And people are just buying these regularly for their dinner parties. Fascinating. Any more questions before I cut you all off? No. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to send you all these slides, plus the little article about wine fraud and a recommendation that you do get the book, Billionaire's Vinegar. So otherwise, I'll see you all next week.